The following podcast contains advertisements. If you prefer a podcast without advertisements, you can sign up for our ad-free version at patreon.com/lawfare. That's patreon.com/lawfare. You'll get rid of the ads and we'll be very grateful.
My solution was to talk to the senior officials, the senior attorneys on the National Security Council, and see if we could right the ship. My efforts were geared towards letting John Eisenberg know that this was a huge risk to both our national security and to our policy, and frankly to the president, whether he knew it or not, that he was potentially doing something criminal. It wasn't clear to me, but I thought that could be something criminal in his machinations, and that these attorneys, whose job it was to provide this kind of check, could draw us back from the edge. That's not the way history unfolded.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, August 3rd, 2021. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is the Pritzker Military Fellow at the Lawfare Institute, a former NSC staffer, and of course, an impeachment witness in the first impeachment of Donald J. Trump. He is also the author of the new book out today, Here Right Matters, An American Story. He joined me in the virtual jungle studio to talk about the book, the ground it covers from his immigration as a small child to his departure from the Army, the decision he made to report what he heard Donald Trump say to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and the fallout, positive and negative. We covered a lot of ground. Brooklyn in the 1980s, a military career and what it does for you when you're a late bloomer, and all kinds of other things. It's the Lawfare Podcast, August 3rd, Alex Vindman on Here Right Matters. So, Alex, I assume you did this whole testifying thing, resigning from the military, getting yourself attacked by the former president, all so that you could write a book, right?
I actually did it because I am a glutton for punishment, and I figured life was too easy just serving my country in the military quietly and out of the limelight. But no, I had no thoughts of anything to do with a book for a long, long time. It just seemed like an odd thing to do. But as we get into it, I'll explain, I guess, why I did it.
Yeah, so actually, let's start there. When and why did you decide to write up this set of experiences as a book?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I should start by saying that as soon as I left the White House, there were like these ridiculous offers to sign a book contract, crazy numbers, $1 million book deals, and all that kind of stuff. And to my wife's chagrin, I basically set all that aside. I pointed out that I'm in the military. I haven't kind of quite figured out if my military career is over with. And I set the whole kind of notion aside. And as I came around to both the conclusion of my military career and started thinking about what I wanted to do afterwards, had the time to reflect after leaving the White House and read through hundreds and actually probably thousands of letters of support, I thought one thing that I can do is to, in my own words, explain what happened with regards to the first impeachment of Donald Trump, the Ukraine scandal, and who I was and why I took the actions I did. So in a lot of ways, this was just an ability to respond to many people, mainly supporters, but even critics, explaining, why I did what I did, what was at stake. In my mind, that included the very kind of bedrock of our democracy and a fair election, and all that came together into this book that is much, much bigger than just a story about a phone call. It's about my immigrant background. It's about my decades of military service. There's some cool kind of war stories. All of that is in there, and how it contributed to my actions.
So the book, as you say, covers a lot more ground than simply what happened in that phone call of, I guess, July 2019. It starts with the phone call, but then it tracks back to your family history in Ukraine, including your father's growing up during the war. So, why did you go back that far? And what's the relationship between the backstory you tell and the story in the introduction, and that forms the sort of dramatic core of the book?
Right. So I believe that we're kind of the sum total of all of our experiences, especially in the most challenging moments. We draw on everything that we learned, both kind of in terms of our childhood, our upbringing, even a deeper history of our family roots. Certainly, my decades of military service were all significant factors in both the decisions I made and how I made them. So, my belief is that I did the right thing in the right way, and that was the sum total of all of my experiences to that point. And I think the backstory is, in certain ways, a quintessential story of family coming from a foreign place. We came here as refugees, establishing ourselves through hard work. One of the kind of the foundational values of America, achieving some gains, some setbacks and losses, learning from the good, the bad, the missteps, the lack of discipline, and then achieving something, and then frankly starting back over. And that's a story that is part of my family background, my family lore, but it's a story that I think everybody could share. Their life is not just kind of a continuous series of steps forward, continuous progress. There are setbacks along the way, and overcoming those setbacks, kind of living with the decisions that you make, the good, the bad, is an important story to tell. And I thought it was required in this case to explain, why I did what I did.
So, one of the things that I learned from this book was a little bit of the backstory of your comments, your famous comment to your father during your hearing, Here Right Matters, which is, of course, the title of the book. I did not know this before, but your father was a Trump supporter and was not at all convinced that testifying, much less testifying about what you regarded as the impropriety of the phone call with Zelensky, was a good idea or the right thing to do. So tell me about this story from your father's point of view. How did he experience it?
Yeah. So now some of that story has been told, I guess, in my testimony. I addressed them directly, but what I get into in the book is really the backstory, and in certain regards, probably not in sufficient detail. There is zero doubt that my dad was channeling his 47 years as a Soviet citizen and his deep concern for me personally, and the consequences of me challenging the president of the United States, an officer with the president of the United States in my direct chain of command, at odds. And they're at odds because I fell on the side of the Constitution, in my view, and the president fell on the side of corruption. So he was channeling that thinking on risk. In addition to channeling his concerns for my personal safety, he was also not fully aware of the corruption of the Trump administration, and there was an appeal for kind of a strong man, somebody that is not part of the swamp, as what he thought, or what he had in his mind, somebody that's not part of the political establishment, being able to get some things done. So, in channeling that perspective, he was also very similar to thousands and thousands of refugees, immigrants, especially from the communist world, that have a visceral reaction to anything on the left. And they hew very closely to the right, to conservatism, and even a unhealthy kind of conservatism, as a absolute rejection of communism. And I've had this conversation with him multiple times, but he's also subject to a kind of propaganda. He was subject to the kind of propaganda that we see on Fox News, but another kind of propaganda that goes through the airwaves that cater to Russian speakers that are owned and operated by interests that, and this is, kind of, there's well established research on this, but that cater to a much more favorable impression of Russia than is warranted. And I think all these things were kind of counseling him to get me to march into the president's office and to somehow say, Mr. President, I was wrong. How do we make this right?
So I take it part of the process for you of going through this was part of it was about addressing Congress and answering people's questions as they considered the impeachment of the president, but part of it was also addressing your father.
With regard to the book, if I understand you correctly?
No. I mean, the process actually of becoming a public person and making these factual claims that you made.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I guess taking small credit, one of my successes was getting my dad to see the light about Donald Trump through my own experiences, because my dad trusts me implicitly. He knows that I'm honorable and wouldn't lie. And through that contrast to what the president was accusing me of and his proxies, vile character assassinations, I convinced him that he was wrong. But he had to live that experience. And that's not that's obviously not a formula for success in deprogramming the kind of rabid following of Donald Trump that has bought into the lies and is now a partisan in their rejection of kind of basic democratic values, as well as big D and small d democracy.
So the story that you tell in this begins, I mean, for you anyway, in leaving Ukraine as a very small child and kind of growing up in Brooklyn. And it's a Brooklyn that I remember very well from my own childhood, but is, I think, pretty far removed from, well, it's pretty far removed from a lot of what people think of as Brooklyn now, which is, all very hipster, but it's also, the people who kind of think of you as this sort of elite, coastal elite attacking the president. You grew up in kind of immigrant Brighton Beach and then Borough Park. Tell us a little about that, like what those communities were like when you were growing up.
Sure. First, let me start by saying it is eerie and it will remain eerie that people will know all this about my background. I come from a kind of a life where I'm out of the limelight, I'm out of the public eye, and information about me is something to be protected and guarded and metered out, potentially in exchange for information about other diplomats. So it's interesting to hear people kind of talk to me about my background.
Well, you did just write a book about it.
I know. I should have expected that. I know. It's one of those things that, maybe I should have thought through this a little more. It's the release date's tomorrow. Maybe I could still pull the plug. I don't know. But it's interesting. When I was growing up, this is probably a bad statistic, but Bedford-Stuyvesant, East Brooklyn, was like the murder capital of the world. You wouldn't go to neighborhoods in Harlem. They were like desolate wastelands with ruined buildings and stuff like that. Same thing with the Bronx. And the city has, had a kind of a renaissance and a revival over the course of the subsequent decades. But in 1979, 1980, it was nothing like that. And I don't want to, overstate, that my background is kind of similar to some of these dramatized stories about the inner city growing up in Compton or something like that. But it was probably much, much closer to something like that than it is to what the perceptions are of Brooklyn and New York City today. It was a rough and tumble kind of tough inner city upbringing. And I talk about some of this in the book about learning to navigate, the streets in New York, getting from point A to point B, navigate kind of the relationships that you need to in order to not constantly get into fights, which I got into plenty of fights when I was growing up. But all that is very, very different than the kind of the image of New York now. And I think it probably resonates with folks that grew up in cities, folks from your and my generation, roughly. That doesn't maybe resonate quite as well with kind of the modern suburban views of both coastal elites and cities, and what I'm very, very fortunate to be able to provide for my daughter.
Right. So you were, like me, a kind of desultory student, and there's a funny account in the book of your family kind of clucking at other kids in the family don't turn out like the Vindman boys, meaning study hard and do your homework.
The cautionary tale. We were the
Yes,
cautionary tale.
exactly. What turned it around for you? You describe yourself as a late bloomer. What was the sort of ray of sunshine that turned things around?
There's no simple kind of pinning down one particular moment. There were a series of kind of failures and reflective moments, and then there was the whole, the fact that I wanted to join the military. That was a kind of a key turning point in which I set out a different course for myself. But I think it was a combination of different events. Leaving American university as either academically suspended or dismissed. I never, frankly, have had good clarity on that one. And then taking a semester off, collecting myself, having my family kind of, give me a firm talking to about what prospects would remain for me if I continued to be like this. Some seasoning, some experience, some life experience, some discipline. Just the late bloomer component is interesting because there's certainly a lack of maturity, but there was also, a concrete kind of physiological change that occurs, as you progress in age and you start to settle down and you work out, you figure out ways to cope with your excess energies and stuff like that. All of that plus military service helped me kind of get on the right track. And one of the things I enjoy most about talking to folks, especially younger students, is the fact that some folks achieve success and discipline early and they're able to stay focused. Other folks do not, and they set themselves up for a much, much more difficult road. And that was the case for me. But they could still kind of break through and achieve the outcomes that they want, which I did to a large extent, and I'll continue to do moving forward. But it's not a smooth road. It's a bumpy road along the way. And I enjoy kind of telling people that there are ways to overcome challenges.
So, skipping ahead, you had, until the day you listened to that phone call, both an exemplary military career, and the military served you very well. I mean, you made your whole career of, 20 years in the military. The last section of the book contains a lot of recriminations toward the Army for the way it handled your situation, and has a quite different tone toward the military than the first sort of 2/3 of the book. So walk me through that change a little bit. The military was kind of good enough to you for long enough that you felt very betrayed by the end game. So before we go to the phone call and the aftermath of the phone call, just talk us through the experience that you had in the military and the expectations of how that created for how they would take care of you.
Sure. So first, let me start by saying, I cherish my time. I still cherish my time in the military. I don't think I would have done anything different with regard to my military career. It just afforded an enormous amount of opportunity. And I attempt to separate my views on the institutions, the awesome institutions that have given me so much within the Army, the Department of Defense, and understandably flawed individuals that run those institutions. And what I think I've concluded is that much like the corruption of other departments and agencies in government and are kind of in the tapestry of American society by internal and external forces, the military was corrupted in the same way. And that is probably not something that's really well understood. The military still has probably about the highest approval rating of any kind of branch of government, and it deserves it. The composition of the military are extremely honorable, wonderful human beings that basically choose a life of service over kind of self-service. And my criticism or my harsh judgment falls squarely on the shoulders of the leaders that are supposed to lead the institutions and exemplify their values, because they demand those values of subordinates. But in my case, I think they fell short. And where they fell short is, a lieutenant colonel serving in the White House has his hands tied. There is no ability to kind of engage with the press, defend yourself, and the institution has an obligation to defend the officer. We've seen some examples of senior military officers that have all the trappings of power and position, and they have their personal security details, they have their PAO shops, and they're able to kind of defend themselves, or in certain regards, organize campaigns to defend themselves. I didn't have any of that, and I was left out by myself. And after 20 years of service, my wife and daughter moving with me everywhere, I had thought that there would be some effort to protect me, and there wasn't. I was in a way left out on the battlefield by myself.
What would that have looked like? I mean, the president is, after all, the commander-in-chief. Yeah. And imagine that the military and the army had lived up to your expectations. How would it have looked different in practice from what happened?
So how would it have looked different in terms of consequences? And I'm going to work my way backward here. We may not have had the military paraded out in the summer of 2020, where the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were paraded out as potential, supporters of suppression of peaceful protests, because the military and the Army and the Department of Defense would have made their position known, in that they've upheld the values of the institution. Now, it could have been other people, obviously, because there was almost certainly the president would have fired whoever kind of pushed back on him, but still the organization would have stayed true to its values. If I were in the same position, I thought that there would be a way to defend the soldier without necessarily directly picking a fight. This Alex Vindman has served honorably for decades. He's in the position on the National Security Council because of his capabilities or something of that nature, without necessarily picking a fight. Conversely, I do have to say, I was operating at the senior levels of government, certainly both at the Pentagon and on the National Security Council, and I understand the desire to stay apolitical, and I understand the desire to protect the institution for these senior leaders. What I don't have clarity on in my own mind was, were these leaders, in leaving me out there by myself, protecting the institution, or were they protecting themselves?
Or did they not quite understand the difference?
Leonig's book on I Alone, that's out right now, it talks about this kind of hubris that affects senior policy makers, that they're the ones that will hold the line. They're the dam against more abuses. They're the guardrail. When in fact, our institutions are deep with professionalism, deep with expertise, and not a single one of these, no matter how capable these leaders, is an I alone. We train in the military to do something called fallout drills. One man out. The leader goes down, somebody else steps up to take charge. And there's a hubris that kind of befalls senior leaders, that they think that they're the only ones that can do that, fill that role. And I think that that's a part of the failing. And I think it also points to maybe a deeper issue with an institution that I honor and love, that resulted in decades of war, commitments that senior leaders made, or counsel that they provided, that did not achieve the military objectives or the political objectives that the country laid out. And I think this is my experience is a symptom of something bigger.
All right, so let's talk about the phone call. You open with the phone call and with your comment to your twin brother moments after the phone call that if this gets out, the president will be impeached. You sort of had this instinct in listening to this that the political system would respond exceptionally badly to, or react very badly to this. What was it specifically about the call that bothered you that much?
I recognized immediately that the president was attacking the very foundation of our democracy, elections, free and fair elections, and that 200 plus years of history had created antibodies to this, and that there would be a reaction. And, without, I didn't say the president would be impeached and removed. The president, it was a visceral reaction. It was not like a whimsical comment. It was just a cool, calm assessment of the gravity of the moment without, frankly, making the connection that it wouldn't necessarily become public. It was a if-then statement. If the president's actions became public, he would be impeached. And I knew immediately that, my role would be to play this tiny role in terms of providing, some sort of check on it. And my solution was to talk to the senior officials, the senior attorneys on the National Security Council, and see if we could right the ship. My efforts were geared towards letting John Eisenberg know that this was a huge risk to both our national security and to our policy, and frankly to the president, whether he knew it or not, that he was potentially doing something criminal. It wasn't clear to me, but I thought that could be something criminal in his machinations, and that these attorneys, whose job it was to provide this kind of check, could draw us back from the edge. That's not the way history unfolded.
Yeah, so let's talk about the role of the attorneys, because John Eisenberg less so, but Michael Ellis, his deputy, subsequently, of course, became a discussion matter for other reasons because of Trump's attempt to install him as general counsel at NSA. How do you understand the role of the attorneys? You came to them and described what happened, and they did, well, at one level, very little, and another level, quite a lot with the information. So give me a sense of how
Sure.
you assess their roles.
Sure. So first of all, let me tell you that I had probably just relatively recently before that finished reading this book by a good friend of mine, John Gans, called White House Warriors. And I think in terms of, I read quite a bit. My undergrad degree was in history. I'm a bit of a history buff. I understood what the roles of the attorneys were. Historically, prior to the 80s, there were no attorneys on the NSC staff. They emerged as a result of a Tower Commission report into the Iran-Contra scandal. And they were there specifically as a check on a national security apparatus that, could stray into illegal, immoral, or unethical areas. So they came into force sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't know exactly the date. And their role was to take a look at every activity, communication up, meaning from the director level or from outside the director up to the national security advisor or to the president and out, communications that were going to the departments and agencies, and provide that kind of check. Having this understanding, that is exactly why I focused my efforts on taking my concerns to the attorneys. Now, if I were still in, for instance, the Department of Defense, I would have recourse to take my concerns either directly through the chain of command or through the Inspector General's office. There was no such recourse. If I wanted to stay within proper channels, not be a leaker, my recourse was simple: notify the attorneys.
All right, so you notified the attorneys, and they seem to have kind of verified with you that you didn't know there was a criminal violation, and then stored the transcript, such as it was, on a secure server and then done nothing else. Is that a fair summary?
That is correct. I think the answer, the easiest way to describe it is they basically took no action initially, and when they did take action, they did it for damage control and not to protect the institution, not to live up to an oath to the Constitution of the United States, but to serve as the president's personal attorneys. And this is a major kind of continuous theme amongst the folks that President Trump put into power. They served as his personal staff as opposed to living up to their obligations to the Constitution. So the reason I could say this pretty kind of definitively is because, as far as I can tell, and I don't have absolute clarity on everything that unfolded, they were happy not to take any actions. They didn't take any actions when I made my first complaint on July 10th. They were initially not looking to take any actions after the July 25th phone call. What drove them to action was the fact that in my coordinating potentially with other departments and agencies, or through another source, there was a whistleblower complaint initiated. And that whistleblower complaint initially started through kind of IG channels that departments and agencies have. And it quickly came to this is a major flaw in the system. So an IG complaint that was made to the CIA then worked its way back to the National Security Council. These are political actors. I guess they coordinate that way instead of like a firewall between them, especially if the complaint is about the White House. And immediately their reaction was to basically limit access to this information. Clearly that resulted in a series of other more aggressive means to address this fundamental issue, this fundamental attack on democracy, where this whistleblower seems to have been dissatisfied with the response he was getting from IG channels, and then put it into this other channel that ended up working its way through Congress. So I would say at some point it would be a good idea to figure out how to keep complaints about the White House from departments and agencies from being kind of obstructed and blocked by the White House. Because that's not the way the system is supposed to work. That's not the way checks and balances are conceived.
In the book, you say that you don't know who the whistleblower is, but you also describe circumstances that suggest that you have a pretty good idea who it must be. Is that fair?
That is fair, but the stakes are so high that the doubt that as to whether it is the person I think it is warrants extreme caution. And that is not my story to tell. It's the whistleblower's story to tell.
No, that's
about
fair.
Why he or she felt like they needed to do that.
I just wanted to clarify the difference between the two levels of knowledge that you're describing.
Suspecting versus knowing.
You have every reason, based on circumstances, to presume that it is a person whom you describe in the book, but you've never asked that person, you wouldn't ask that person, and you have no other authoritative means of knowing. Is that fair?
That is exactly right. There's a difference between suspecting and knowing, and I don't, in fact, know with certainty who the person is. And I think the person, that the whistleblower is a sophisticated actor in their own right. When they wrote up their whistleblower complaint, they attributed it to multiple sources. So that again adds to this, quite reasonable doubt as to who's the original source, who is involved in kind of the initial complaint. But I could talk about my role and what I contributed to this.
Yeah. So, I mean, as best as I can reconstruct from the book, you were obviously party to this conversation. You raised concerns about the conversation. You described it to two people who you say in the book had need to know based on that it was proper to give it to them. And somewhere down that chain, either directly or indirectly, somebody turns around and files that whistleblower complaint. Is that right?
That is correct. Yep. I think their assessment was that, depending on who the actual source was for the whistleblower, that this issue would not be addressed within the White House and it needed to go through alternative channels.
And that assessment turned out to be correct because
Absolutely.
your bringing it to John Eisenberg's attention did not result in anything.
It's interesting. This is a counterfactual that I fortunately don't have to deal with. What would have happened if there was no whistleblower? What would I have done?
What would you have done?
Certainly, I had the conviction to both make the initial complaint and to testify without kind of minimizing what I heard or with a careerist interest to protect myself. I think that's a good enough basis to say that I wouldn't let things stand. But it's not something I could say with absolute certainty. What I could tell you, though, is that we were right on the brink of the president concluding his enterprise. What's not well known is that Zelensky had scheduled an interview with CNN, and literally days before is when Congress initiated their inquiries. 3 House committees initiated their inquiries into the hold on security assistance. So we were just on the cusp of the president realizing his enterprise and tarnishing Joe Biden as his principal adversary. And that's probably a point in time where I would have had to either, stomp my feet up and down or figure out another way to really address a attack on our democratic system. And I don't know what I would have done in that case, but it would have, the current President Biden, would have absolutely been harmed. And who knows if he would have ended up as the Democratic nominee because President Trump had realized his corrupt enterprise.
So what do you make of the impeachment in retrospect? You look back on it, you say, well, I come out and told the truth. A bunch of other people, Masha Yovanovitch and George Kent and Fiona Hill, and came out and told the truth. John Bolton didn't bother. The truth came out, and the House Democrats impeached and Senate Republicans stopped it from going forward. And the president clearly didn't learn a whole lot from it, notwithstanding what Susan Collins might say. So what value did the whole thing serve?
So first of all, I could say in one sense, it was an absolute failure on checks and balances. It was also a success, but let me start with the failure. What I see is a continuous logic thread between the president not being held accountable by the Senate, no censure, no negative actions whatsoever, and the president being emboldened and acting with impunity and incompetence going into the COVID pandemic. If there was any accountability whatsoever, I have every reason to believe that we would not have had 600,000 people die. If the Senate had done its job and the president was removed, absolutely the pandemic would have been handled differently.
You mean just because Mike Pence is a more competent guy than Donald Trump?
Absolutely. And he would have acted in accordance with what a skilled executive, because he was an executive at the state level, would have done, and we wouldn't have had this kind of polarization and political warfare driving down everything from the very notion of a pandemic to the effective means to combat the notion through vaccines. There is blood on the Senate Republicans' hands. If they had done their job, 600,000 people would not have died. One. And then we wouldn't have had a catastrophic reaction with the economy, and we wouldn't have had blood on the streets with regards to protests. So the Senate is responsible for that. And one means of accountability is to hold those senators and to hold those officials that were enablers to the president accountable. And that's a mission of mine going forward. But on another level, the antibodies, the antibodies that were available based on 200 years of democracy and professional public servants doing their jobs, providing testimony, was the first crack, the first chip away at the president's claims of good governance. You could see the continuous thread there. At that point, the president was impeached, and it was brought to light for large swaths of this country that the president is actually, in fact, a corrupt actor. That, plus the massive catastrophe of 600,000 dead, the president inflaming protests, all of that came together to allow President Biden to defeat President Trump. And we contributed to that. We public servants, the antibodies against corruption, contributed to that. And then the public, the United States citizenry, held the president accountable ultimately where the Senate failed. And that, I think, is a success. So it's hard to reconcile those two, but I think you could have it both ways there, I think.
So a supporter of the president or the former president, if he were listening, might say, listen to this guy, Vindman. He just described as a success that he helped people come to decide, he and other people in the deep state helped the public decide to vote against me. That's actually what I've been saying about the deep state from the beginning, right? It's the Alex Vindmans and Pete Strzok's and, Andy McCabe's, and they all want the Democrats to win. What's your response to that? That on the one hand, you talk about apolitical service, and you clearly mean it. But on the other hand, part of your definition of success here was that, you guys helped Joe Biden unseat Donald Trump. Reconcile that for me.
Yeah. It's actually, for me, it's really, there's quite a bit of clarity around this issue. The judgments that come in and would label me as a deep stater are political partisan judgments. When a impartial, fair assessment would suggest that all I did was do my duty. Myself and my colleagues, all we did was do our duty. We reported what we saw. We gave factual testimony and left it to the political actors to either move forward through to impeachment or to basically embolden the president by not holding him accountable with regards to Republican actors. I still consider myself apolitical. I think I write about it in the book. I made it a point to not come in support of a political party, but instead challenge the president based on the actions he took. I mean, my life would be a lot easier if I were still serving in government, if I didn't say anything and didn't do my job. But that would be sacrificing my oath and my duty. And I think that's what I'm going to go with, because that's what I believe. That's what allows me to kind of live with myself and to kind of deal with some of the costs of all this.
So let's talk about the costs before we wrap up. You've never thought of yourself as a controversial person. Your whole career has been apolitical military service, and all of a sudden you are not just a household name, but a highly divisive figure with a lot of people out there who really hate you, and a lot of people out there who are saying all kinds of things about you, ranging from accusations of espionage to suggestions that you're kind of a fifth columnist. What was your experience of that? I've talked to a lot of people who've gone through a version of that, and they all experienced it differently. How did you experience it?
It's been difficult. There's no question that I found myself at some point struggling, not with things that would necessarily kind of be intuitive. Certainly there were the character attacks and the threats, and there was some concern about family safety. At one point we had considered moving on to an installation. My wife felt those things more acutely. What I felt was the fact that I was giving up something that had worked very hard to achieve, and I was entering into a brave new world where I didn't have the security and the comfort of knowing exactly where I was going, where I was going to end up. And even now, trying to understand what I might want to do going forward. I've been, as you know, I've been involved in a bunch of different things, whether it's non-governmental organizations looking to renew democracy, on academia, working on a doctorate in a think tank with you and the Lawfare team. But I still, frankly, don't know what it is I want to do. What do I want to commit myself to? And that's been kind of a challenge. I think it's a natural challenge for a lot of people that have to think about what they want to do for a second career. All of this kind of fell on my shoulders abruptly, and I'm still working through it. But at the same time, its own reward was doing the right thing, recognizing that I lived up to my obligations. I could pinpoint exactly where I made a difference in terms of defending this country against enemies, foreign and domestic, and not have to wonder about what it is, go through the typical midlife crisis about what it is I've done over the course of a 20-year career. I mean, that's something that I could take pride in. I could take pride in the fact that my daughter could look at me now and when she gets older and recognize that her dad did the right thing and attempted to do it in the right way. And that might be the only clear kind of reward. The rest of it falls in the checks and balance column, or maybe on the loss side, but I could live with it.
We're going to leave it there. The book is Here Right Matters, An American Story. The author is Alex Vindman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Our audio engineer this episode is Hamza Situ of Goat Rodeo. You need to do your part to promote the Lawfare podcast, so share us on all the socials, leave us a rating or review wherever you found us, buy the merch at thelawfarestore.com. The Lawfare podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. And as always, thanks for listening.